last and final session, but hasn't it been a great day? Again, thanking the Committee for International Trade of the Saudi Chambers for working with us, and the New America Foundation, which has for a very long time wanted to do, from our radical centrist perspective, to bring more of these issues first and foremost into the public eye and to have very real discussions. I've invited a friend of mine who is not an expert in the Middle East. He happened to be an expert in India. But I said, the problem is there are too many people in the weeds in this relationship. We need people who ask sharp, tough questions, who are great political columnists and observers. And Edward Luce, there is no one better, unless I talk to you outside and you happen to be a bureau chief of another publication. But Ed Luce is the Washington bureau chief of the Financial Times. And give him a big round of applause. Really appreciate him joining us. Why don't you join us up here, Ed, and take over your fantastic panel. I should also add very quickly as one quick point that Ambassador Nigel Sheinwald, who is a great friend of the New America Foundation, apparently, in the same meeting with Anne-Marie Slaughter, my former manager, has had a bit of a crisis come in, and it was so good to have Neil Crompton join us. So this was a last-minute switch, a switch nonetheless we're very happy to have you here for. I imagine that you would have been writing Nigel's talking points anyway. So in any case, Ed Luce.
Thanks, Steve. You'll be relieved to hear that because you've got such a large panel, you're not going to be getting any of my thoughts on Saudi Arabia, which is just as well because I'm not qualified to give you any. I am qualified to ask provocative and simplistic questions, but I'll save that for a little bit later. I think because it's such a large panel and we haven't got a huge amount of time, I'll introduce each of the panelists and warn them that I will, it's a rare situation for a journalist to have the right to interrupt dignitaries with excellent and honorable before their name, but I will exercise that right ruthlessly if any of you talk too long. So please confine your opening remarks to 10 minutes maximum, preferably 5 minutes. Most need no introduction, but I'll give you very quick ones. Anne-Marie Slaughter is, of course, the head of the policy planning at State Department and formerly the dean, as you know, of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. We then have Neil Crompton, who's standing in for Nigel Sheinwald, and Neil is you're the counselor on the Middle East at the British Embassy. We then have the Honourable Abdul Rahman Al Said, who is an advisor to the Royal Court and who is Director General of Specialized Studies in Riyadh. We have the Honourable Waish Fowler, former senator and ambassador to Saudi Arabia. We have the only person who, I don't know whether this is deliberate, the only person who Steve hasn't prefixed with honourable or excellent is Joseph Macmillan, who I had the opportunity to talk to before and can quite happily, from that brief interchange, say that he is an excellent person and highly honourable. So, and he's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs at the Pentagon. We have His Excellency Pierre Vimont, the French ambassador to Washington. And that is our long and distinguished and honorable and excellent panel. Anne-Marie, can I ask you to... You could go last. Neil, in that case, would you be so kind as to start?
Oh, sure.
Nice to meet you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to be here. I apologize for the ambassador's absence, and in the presence of such a distinguished panel, I feel a little junior. But I should do my best, not least because my first job in the Foreign Office I spent covering Saudi Arabia, albeit some 10 years ago. I think I was asked to talk a little bit about the perspective of how the UK sees relations with Saudi Arabia and how that complements the US's approach. I think for an audience like this, don't need to say the UK is known for its very strong relations with Saudi Arabia. I think there are three different dimensions to that. I think it's a deep-rooted historical relationship. For better or worse, the UK was either an observer or protagonist in many of the events that led up to the creation of Saudi Arabia after the First World War. I think the second and perhaps enduring reason has been strategic interest. UK-Saudi relationship has been punctuated by a series of bilateral disputes over many years, but our common strategic interests have kept us together on many of the big security challenges of the last 70 or years or so, particularly the Cold War. We were on the same side of the argument, if not necessarily formal allies. And I think mutual interests keep us closely bound together. A common interest in ensuring a steady supply of oil is one of those, but the commercial relations are enormously important to both of our countries, and people-to-people contacts are enormously important. I think anyone who's been to London in July or August and walked up Edgware Road, seen the sort of color and vitality that Saudi Arabia and their friends in the Gulf bring to London will be familiar with that. There's a similar flow of people going the other way to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. In 2009, there were 14,000 Saudi students studying in the UK, an extraordinary number. And Saudi Arabia is the UK's most important market outside the OSCE, with our trade relationship worth over $4 billion a year. I think by and large, the UK and US relations with Saudi Arabia are complementary. There have been times of competition between our two countries. On the odd occasion, indeed, when the United States has outmaneuvered us. In 1945, for example, when President Roosevelt hosted King Abdulaziz on his boat in the Red Sea, he won plaudits for refraining from smoking in King Abdulaziz's presence, whereas Winston Churchill, as he would want the character, was puffing away and causing some offense. We then compounded the error when FDR gave Abdulaziz a DC-3 plane, with which King Abdulaziz was delighted. We, in contrast, gave him a Rolls-Royce, which would have been fine, but it was a right-hand drive. And in Saudi Arabia, servants sit on the right of the car. Puncturing the myth that the FCO is laden with Arabists who know their surroundings. Very good. But I think today we're united by a set of common challenges. We're all reviewing President Obama's first 100 days in office. I think there's a common consensus among the foreign policy pundits that the range of foreign policy challenges is extraordinary. And when you look at the big ticket items, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, the broader Middle Eastern question, Saudi Arabia is centrally involved in all of those. So we're working very closely with them at the political level. I think on Afghanistan, Pakistan, we're very pleased with the way Saudi Arabia has brought greater stability. In particular, their pledge to give $700 million to Pakistan during the Tokyo Donors Conference. They're working with the UK, US, and other NATO countries in regularizing some of that assistance and committing it to sustainable development projects. And I think Saudi Arabia has, over the years, built up some unique contacts with both the Afghan government and the Taliban, and has the opportunity to play an important role in bringing forward the political process. Iran is the second of the great challenges we face. There's a lot of overlap in UK and Saudi thinking both about the nature of the challenge and the problems that would arise from Iran acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. We've been working closely with, over the years, both as E3 and with the United States and Russia and China to develop a coherent diplomatic strategy. I think our moderate Arab friends in the region have an important role to play in that. We saw a successful development of a dialogue between the E3 plus 3 and the GCC countries, plus Jordan and Egypt and latterly Iraq, to discuss Iran. I think we've been at pains to try and point out that diplomatic progress with Iran should not come at the expense of the security interests of the Gulf states, an area where we need to do more work and an area where we need to develop our dialogue. But I think there is also more that the Gulf states can do to exercise their diplomatic leverage in the next phase. We are in a new phase. The US is committed to engaging. That gives us opportunities, also gives us challenges, and I think that the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states can do more to help us contain Iran's malign influence in the region. And this brings us to my final area of common interest, I think the Middle East peace process. The UK strongly welcomes the constructive role Saudi Arabia has played in this over the years, in particular in promoting and keeping alive the Arab Peace Initiative, a commitment that was restated shortly after the election last year. President Obama has welcomed this, Secretary Clinton has welcomed this. I think David Miliband, when talking about the peace process, talks about the need not just for a two-state solution, but for a 23-state solution involving both a secure Israel and an independent Palestine, and all the members of the Arab League at peace with each other. So what we are working for in this next phase is to try and ensure a positive response to the Arab Peace Initiative from the Israeli government, and a willingness by Israel and the Arab League to make clear the benefits of the Arab Peace Initiative so that both sides can take mutual steps towards each other, and we can begin working towards a situation in which we can develop a framework for a comprehensive peace agreement that allows us to deal with some of the other demanding strategic challenges like Iran. We very much welcome the comments that Secretary Clinton made about the linkage between these two issues last week. Those are some of the challenges. There's more we can do. I think Iraq is a big challenge. Saudi Arabia we've had differences, I think, on the United States, UK, about the original decision to move into Iraq. We now have a common interest in making the Iraq process work with Saudi Arabia. We welcome the steps that Saudi Arabia and other Arabs have taken to embrace Iraq, bring it back into the Arab fold, and I think that will be one of the most constructive roles that countries can play in helping stabilize the situation in Iraq. I think there are other important areas of cooperation. Counterterrorism, Saudi Arabia, UK in different ways have been at the forefront of international efforts to promote interfaith dialogue. I think Saudi Arabia has learned a lot of lessons about de-radicalization, which can usefully be transferred to other countries. I think these are all form part of a process of strategic cooperation that we've developed over many decades and which we're committed to continuing. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Abdul Rahman, please.
Good afternoon. It's always nice to come back to Washington. First time I came to this town, it's a town, not a big city yet, was in 1976. I joined the Center for Arab Studies as an outside observer. I don't know how do you place that in an educational institute, but that's what I was doing. Yesterday, I walked around Georgetown with a friend. And I saw some of the students walking around the campus. I looked at my friend and I said, what's happening? The students, the student population is getting younger. He had very thick glasses and he looked at me and he said, Abdurrahman, they're not getting younger, you're getting older. And I said, much older. So I'm happy to be with you here today to talk about, essentially I was supposed to talk about the Arab Peace Initiative, but then everybody talked about it. I have nothing else to say on that issue. I thought maybe I should talk about the new environment in Saudi Arabia. We have now what you may call outstretched environment or outstretched hand, whereby King Abdullah has put together first the Arab Peace Plan in 2002. It sounded then like Saudi Arabia was not exactly, in some minds, not exactly the place from which such a plan could come from, but they didn't know what was coming. A couple of years after that, King Abdullah initiated the national dialogue. This dialogue, as you may know, has in fact penetrated all parts of our society. It has in fact been participated in by men, women, school students, by everyone in the country. And it has really achieved great results for us. As a result, I think the kinds of tensions that were present in Saudi society at that time have actually eased a great deal. So much so that, in fact, we have now a new environment. You read the press, for example. You see a new openness. You see a new boldness in our media that is really unprecedented in our country, and some say in our part of the world, in fact. Then, of course, we had the interfaith dialogue. This is another outstretched hand or an extended hand. to the rest of the world, to other religions, other faiths, other people in this world. And you know, some of us have had their misgivings about this. Until we saw what happened in Madrid, until we saw what happened in New York, and we were all heartened by the results. So much so that I think every Saudi you meet takes great pride in the results that have been achieved as of course, as a result of this initiative. The peace process, or the API, the Arab Peace Initiative, is part and parcel, is part of this parcel. It's, of course, also an attempt to create a new environment of peace, cooperation, and hopefully stability in our part of the world. The last of these initiatives you may all have heard about is the King Abdullah's call for reconciliation and solidarity within the Arab world. And this has, of course, been received very well by the other Arab countries, so that we have now, in fact, the beginnings of real reconciliation within the Arab world. One can, of course, talk about all of these things, but I can go back to my student days when talking about the Arab Peace Initiative. I recall, and maybe those who are of my age recall, when we talk to people here about the Arab-Israeli conflict, everyone will tell you, you guys know only one kind of language. It's the language of war. You have no peace proposals. You only know to talk in militant terms. And you know, it was a difficult position to be in. You try to defend, but people do not receive your defense well. Until in 2002, we have the Arab Peace Initiative. Now, for 7 years, the Arab Peace Initiative stood with no response from the other side. Not only from the other side, but also from this side here. We were really, I mean, someone like me was really perplexed. I mean, here we were told that you Arabs cannot speak the language of peace, that you only know the language of war. And then when we spoke and when we advanced this proposal, it was not well received. In fact, only, I guess, 2 or 3 days ago, the Foreign Minister of Israel, Lieberman, I don't know if you've heard what he said. He said this peace initiative will end up in destroying Israel. Now, I thought wars destroy countries, not peace proposals. So it's almost like damned if you do, damned if you don't. But what all this really boils down to is a new environment in Saudi Arabia, a new outlook. We have a leader who has got vision, who has got the boldness to come out and speak and ask for the cooperation and the understanding of the rest of the world. And, you know, we have actually achieved great success with this. And maybe if you have any questions on this, I can try to respond to them later on. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Senator Fowler.
Good job.
Thank you.
I want to say to the all the Saudis here, especially members of the ambassador's staff, your students are doing extremely well. They've been mentioned twice now. We're back to 26,000 Saudi students studying in the United States, sponsored by the Kingdom. I was asked to pinch hit for Ambassador Jubair, of all places, the University of Northern Iowa in January. As a Georgia boy, I've never been so cold in my life, in the snows and in the snow banks. But in seated with the president of the University of Northern Iowa, I asked him quite naturally, how are they doing? He said, they're doing fantastic. And I said, really? He says, yes, they're above average. Went on and on to praise them. Well, I had to push him a little bit. I thought he was just taking the party line. I said, you don't have any problems? He said, well, they can't make it to classes before noon, and they get arrested for fast driving 6 times a week. So at least I knew he was telling the truth about how well they were doing and how they had been accepted not only by the administration but by the students there. As they say in the Congress, I want to associate myself with the remarks of my friend Abdullah Al-Said and expand on them only in this way and very briefly. I'm sure our new president, after 100 days, laments almost every evening the unfortunate timing of his arrival in the highest office in our land, with all the problems that confront him and that were waiting for his desk. There's one, in light of our context in our talks today, there's one great fortunate timing, that he came to office with the King of Saudi Arabia, our premier Arab ally, at the height of his powers and the height of the respect within his country, within the region, and within the major powers of the world who have become acquainted with King Abdullah. The timing of King Abdullah is also fortunate because we have a phenomena today, if we know how to, administration knows how to take advantage of it, that according to every poll, the political leader, the President of the United States of America, is more popular with people who cannot vote for him than people who can. He's doing fine, thank you very much, with a 65-67% approval rating in the United States, but that is nothing compared to the respect and the approval that he has in the Middle East, parts of Europe, and other parts of the world. There's also a dimension between these two men that has not been mentioned, and maybe people will disagree. In my opinion, they both possess what I call a spiritual impulse that is unique in modern-day political leaders. You cannot read President Obama's 2 books, follow his campaign, his speeches, before he came to office, but especially in these 100 days, and not realize that he understands the role of religion and spirit in the life of people. Or to put it in political terms, that their religion and their spiritual life usually counts for more in their motivation, in their goals, in their hopes for their families and their countries than all the politics put together. And for what Abdul Rahman just said, in my 5 years of conversation in Saudi Arabia within the Crown Prince and now the King, I can tell you that I knew this initiative on interfaith dialogue was coming. I knew that he would speak out on the role, the similarities, and the joint hopes of the 3 great monotheistic religions of the world. And that it was only through the cooperation in matters of the spirit between Jews and Muslims and Christians, could genuine progress and solidarity on many of these problems throughout the region be solved. You have heard a lot about the centrality of Saudi Arabia today in dealing with the Afghans, certainly with the Pakistanis. Our hopes for a solidified Iraq that will not happen without the Saudis and their understanding of Sunni Shia differences. But I leave you with just one word where there's no dispute of their centrality: Jerusalem. The Palestinians will never agree to any peace proposal, comprehensive peace proposal, without the endorsement and blessing of the Saudis on the ultimate status of Jerusalem. Why? Because you know they are the custodians of the two holy mosques in Mecca and Medina, but in the Islamic world, all 2 billion of them, that custodianship extends to the third holiest place in Islam, in Jerusalem. And as a failed politician, I can switch in from the religious to the absurd. I have never been able to understand why any of the three, Christian, Muslim, or Jew, ever wanted to be the exclusive custodian in Jerusalem, because my reading of history, every time that's happened, you're going to have a 200 or 300 year war for the other two to take it back. I'm hoping that our president, with these impulses, in combination with King Abdullah, with his impulses, will use that as the beginning of a comprehensive peace, as Mr. Brzezinski and others, peace alliance that will be based on an understanding of each other's political needs, their cultural history, but more importantly, the primary motivation of man, his religious impulse. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thanks to the New America Foundation for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you today. The title of this panel is Looking at the Middle East Through Saudi and Other Lenses. And since I don't feel qualified to talk about it through a Saudi lens, and since Abdurrahman Al Sayed is much better positioned to do that than I am, what I'd like to do is to take a look at the region and the kingdom's role in it through the U.S. defense lens, because that's the area that I work in. Now, I thought about going through the history of U.S.-Saudi defense engagement, but I figured there's not nearly enough time. Second, it's well enough known that I don't need to. And third, there are people here in the room who created a good bit of that history, and I'd be just asking for trouble if I tried to recite it. But I'd just like to make the point that while this cooperation has been extraordinarily close, and Saudi Arabia has clearly been one of the United States' most important partners in the Middle East, it really has never been trouble-free. And by 2001, when 9/11 happened, the strains were very serious and very apparent. A lot of that had to do with the prolonged U.S. military presence in the kingdom. When then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney had gone to Jeddah to see King Fahd back in 1990, he promised him that the United States would send troops in force to meet the Iraqi threat, that they would stay as long as it was necessary to do the job, and then they would leave. And I don't think anyone thought at the time that it would take 12 years to do the job. And the fact that it did take 12 years created a lot of stress in the relationship. Since 2001, I think those tensions have been aggravated in many ways. The fact that the peace process went into a stall when the Al-Aqsa Intifada started in 2000. very importantly, the involvement of Saudi citizens in the 9/11 attacks and the role that some Saudis had in raising money for radical groups. On the American side, by rather emotional and not very rational calls for regime change in Riyadh as somehow the answer to the problem of al-Qaeda, as if al-Qaeda wouldn't be delighted with regime change in Riyadh. And finally, most recently, sharp disagreements over whether to overthrow the Iraqi regime by force. Saudi deep discomfort with the disorder that came to Iraq in the aftermath of the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, concerns about the nature of the new government, and finally, of course, the prospect that Iranian influence in Iraq would grow as a result of the change. All of that sounds like a very bleak picture, and yet when I came back to the Pentagon after a few years off being a scholar and talked to the Middle East staff a couple of weeks ago, what I was told is U.S.-Saudi military relations haven't been better in years. We seem to have turned a page, and people in the Pentagon are very optimistic about this relationship. Well, to some degree, I've been there before, but I do think that we are facing an era where there is great possibility for cooperation. We have a lot of common challenges to face. Many of them are different from what we've dealt with in the past. All of them are closely intertwined, and I'd like to sort of briefly touch on 4 of them. One is violent extremism. This threat affects the United States and Saudi Arabia in very different ways, but nevertheless, we have found opportunities to work together in confronting it. One major area that affects the Department of Defense as well as much of the rest of the U.S. government is a new initiative that's being led by state with support of other agencies to increase the capabilities of the Saudi Ministry of the Interior to secure critical energy infrastructure as well as other key facilities. In addition to dealing with these direct threats, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia also have the challenge of working together to find ways to blunt the threat of extremism at its sources. There are press reports just came out last week about initiatives from the Yemeni side asking Saudi Arabia to cooperate with Yemen more closely in trying to bring law and order to the border areas where al-Qaeda operatives are known to be taking shelter. And Mr. Crumpton also mentioned earlier the extraordinarily successful Saudi program for rehabilitating and deprogramming former extremists. And I agree completely that this is something that we need to be studying as a model for possible adoption elsewhere in the Islamic world. Second big issue, Iraq. As I've already said, it's no secret that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia didn't see eye to eye on the 2003 invasion or on much of the aftermath. Nevertheless, there are changes that have come to Iraq. When I was in Riyadh in January and had the opportunity to meet with Mr. Al-Sayed, who was part of our discussions, we found that many in the kingdom didn't seem to be fully aware of the positive trends that were happening in Iraq. I think since then, Saudis have become more aware of those positive trends and have started to take tentative steps toward accommodating that and recognizing that in their policy. But from the U.S. perspective, we think that one of the key elements in overcoming many of the continuing problems that Iraq faces, that the solution lies in getting Iraq re-anchored back into the region as a whole, as a full-fledged functioning member, not just of the Arab world, but of a regional security architecture more broadly. Saudi Arabia has to play a leading role in that. Its influence is too great and too important for it to opt out and not take the lead. The best way to ensure that Iran doesn't have excessive influence in Baghdad is for others to go in and counter that influence on the ground. Third, speaking of Iran, the Iranian threat more generally, even outside Iraq, and the question of some kind of regional security architecture. Now, when I started working on Saudi Arabia, which is a long time ago, about 20 years ago now, the Iranian threat was what we were working with. That was the main thing of concern to people who were dealing with the U.S.-Saudi security relationship. It was eclipsed by Iraq for a long time. Now it's back with a vengeance. I don't need to recite the dangers posed to the region by Iranian acquisition of a nuclear weapon, but even short of that, by increasing Iranian influence, by the current Iranian regime's capacity for troublemaking and destabilizing throughout the region. Again, whether it's the enforcement of sanctions that are aimed at preventing Iran's nuclearization, or finding ways to deter and defend against the use of weapons should Iran obtain them, or simply dealing with the consequences after the fact, cooperation among all of Iran's neighbors is vital. And again, Saudi leadership is essential for such cooperation. And finally, on Israeli-Palestinian peace, I can say that Saudi leadership is necessary, and in this area in particular, it certainly hasn't been lacking. And I don't need to recite again, others have done it very well, the important role that first King Fahd and now King Abdullah have played in pushing the peace process along. I would only suggest the effectiveness of that Saudi example and leadership on this front is a good indication of what the kingdom can accomplish on these other fronts that I've been talking about, given the determination to exert that leverage. So what's the way forward? When I was preparing for this, I went back and looked at something I wrote back in 2001. I actually wrote it before 9/11 ever happened, that identified 5 different steps to put the U.S.-Saudi relationship back on track. And they were: give renewed attention to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, articulate a positive vision for the region, that's a positive U.S. vision, undertake a genuine strategic dialogue to harmonize U.S. and Saudi interests and approaches, set priorities. We have a habit of overstressing Saudi capacities. I think we forget sometimes that such a rich country really only has about 1/10 the number of people that the United States does, and it's easy to overstretch the capacity of Riyadh to pay attention and do all the things we want them to do all at once. So there's a priority setting that needs to be done. And finally, don't make cooperation harder than it has to be. A lot of folks here who've served with the U.S. government in Saudi Arabia, as well as people who've dealt with Saudi issues here in Washington, know how we sometimes on both sides make cooperation harder than it needs to be. But we need to remember, we are in a new era. We need to set past disagreements aside instead of reliving them over and over again. And we need to learn from the frictions that caused tensions in the past and figure out better ways of doing business so that we don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Thank you very much. Sorry. It is.
Well, thank you for the New American Foundation for inviting me to speak. I'm very impressed because I'm the French on the podium, the only one who really doesn't know how to speak English in a proper way, but I'll try to do my best. And secondly, I'm quite impressed because I was asked to explain the complexity of the Middle East at the moment through French lenses. And I'm not sure that a French can bring simplicity in what is a complex situation. When I was asked to do that, it reminded me of a quotation by one of our very old prime ministers from the time of First World War, Président du Conseil, Monsieur Clemenceau, who used to say, a camel is a horse that has been designed by a French parliamentary committee. So this is more or less what I'm going to try to do now, and I apologize in advance. Very shortly, a few observations, because I think then it will be time to leave the floor for Anne-Marie, who will say much more interesting things that I can say. But I think I just want to give you 4 or 5 observations from a French point of view about what's going on in this area at the moment, as far as French can see. I think the first impression I get when I look at that region, and this goes back to some of the experience I had to face, it's the increasing number of actors that are trying to play a part in that area. If you just compare the situation at the time of the Lebanon crisis in 2006 and what has happened very recently, the last Gaza events at the end of 2008, 2009, It is very amazing and very impressive to look at the way the number of actors have increased in trying to solve that issue. Once again, understand me well, I'm not trying to complain. I think they are trying, each one of them, to help to find a solution, and I think this is for the best. But still, the increasing complexity has to be taken into account. Just think for 1 second about on the Arab side, where at the time of the Lebanon crisis in 2006, we were mostly dealing with Lebanon and Israel, of course, fighting each other, but mostly the whole Arab countries inside in their own group, trying to help us to find a solution. It was mostly at the time in the UN, the United States and France trying to reach an agreement and propose a draft resolution on that issue. In the last events that took place, you had the initiatives that were taken by Qatar with the help of Syria. On the other side, Egypt, trying to find another way through. And in between, I would say Saudi Arabia with some other countries trying also to find a compromise. Then if you look on the other side, you had, of course, some European countries like Spain, Germany, or France, but you had also Turkey that tried in the best way possible to help to find a solution. And then you even had, at one point, some new partners like Brazil who came in and tried to see if they could help by a way or another. So the number of actors that are now wishing to participate in the Middle East is in itself a factor, I think, of complexity, even if each one of them wants to help. The second factor of complexity, as far as I can see, is the fact that today, if we look at the whole region, it's not only anymore about the peace process, mostly in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's getting more and more also about Iraq on one side, Iran and all the issue of the nuclear program, and also other issues that may have arisen around that country. To some extent, one could see also a link appearing there with the Afghanistan and Pakistanis problem, which means that the links increasingly appearing between those different issues makes it also more and more complicated to find a quick answer. You remember that for many years we used to say find a solution to the peace process and everything will just by miracle find its place inside the area. And I think we're still saying that a lot. And I'm not so sure, in fact, if we look at the reality of today in the Middle East, that we can guarantee with great assurance that if we find a solution quickly in the whole question of Israel and the Palestinian, all the other problems that arise in the region will just disappear by chance. I think it's becoming more and more complicated today, and that rather than trying to go for a solution on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is necessary nowadays to look at all those issues that are there as some sort of single front on which we have to advance in the best way possible, trying to push our cards and our assets in each one of those difficult challenges that we're facing, to try to find a solution at the end that will put all the pieces of the puzzle in the right perspective, in the right direction. I think that if we don't look at the Middle East through that way, through those lenses, to that way of looking at it, we're in for some more difficult situation as we go along. And I think the third observation, of course, which is an obvious one if you look at history, but I think you need it. You need to say it and to emphasize it as we go along, is that for the last 30 or 40 years, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was mostly what we tend to call in France a nationalistic conflict, a conflict between one state that wanted to defend its sovereignty and its security, and another population on the other side that wanted to exist also and have its own state. It was a rather simple approach through which all the different members of the Arab community could define themselves, and which was a rather simple way to go ahead. I think that today things have complicated themselves. This nationalistic approach is still there very much. This perspective is still there, but it is now entwined and intermingled with another issue that is appearing more and more, and which is, of course, the divisions inside the Muslim world, Muslim community, between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the increasing influence of Iran, the part it wants to play, and the responsibility it wants to gain in the region, and the fact that faced with that challenge, more and more countries inside that area are trying to find their own way. Just think about Syria, think about Iraq, and we could name many others, of course. I won't go into that. And the fact that even political movements inside each one of those countries, think about Hezbollah, think about Hamas also, have to position themselves and to find their own position with regard to the Iranian influence, just increase and complicates even more the whole situation. And I think that this has to be looked more and more to be looked at with more and more attention as we go along. I'll end there only with a few remarks to end my very short observation. I think if we want to go ahead, we need, of course, 2 or 3 things. The first one is to be aware that time today is of the essence if we want to find a solution. I think we have lost too much time, of course, in the Middle East, all of us together. This is, as I think Henry Kissinger very frequently reminds us, this is a problem, the peace process problem, of which we know more or less all of us what should be the solution. It can be written rather quickly. And this is maybe one of the only cases in our history since the Second World War where we're facing a crisis that has been going on for so long, where we all know more or less what the solution may be. And I think that if we don't accept that situation and face that challenge now with the understanding that if we don't act quickly, things are going to get worse and worse, we are lacking a sense of responsibility as we're going ahead. The recent events in Gaza, I think we all have to be aware that even in my country and other countries in Europe have had a major impact. And among the young Muslims in our national community in France, but I think elsewhere also in other parts of Europe, this has attracted a lot of attention, and this has not remained unseen, and this will stay with us now for some time. The second remark I would say is that I think we really have to work, all of us, very closely. The previous speakers talked a lot about the Saudi leadership. There's no doubt that the Saudis are absolutely essential in trying to find a solution, and we need all to work with them very closely. The United States, of course, also, the Europeans, all the countries in the area. But I think if we don't coordinate our initiatives and not try all together in short time to try to see how we can all push a solution all together in the right direction, we're going to face more difficulties in the future. And my last observation, a quick one also, is that let's take into account what is the reality of that region today. I think quite too often when we are trying to discuss among diplomats what should be done, too often we go back to the old cliche and to the prejudice that we have with regard to the different countries in the area and the different issues we're facing as we were looking at them 10 or 15 years ago. In the global world of today, reality is changing very quickly. What we can say, for instance, about the Hamas, as it was about 2 or 3 years ago, is maybe not exactly the same today. The same with the Hezbollah also. And what happened in 2006 during the Lebanon crisis left some lessons to the Hezbollah, and this movement is moving in certain directions, maybe some good ones, some more worrisome ones, but we have to be aware of what is the reality on the ground. Think about Syria, think about Jordan, think about all the countries in the area, think even about Iran, which is facing in the next few days a very important election. In all those countries, in all those movements, things are moving. The position of the different players are moving. The things are changing. The reality is a very mobile one, and I think we have to be aware of that if we want to be able to catch with reality as it goes on. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for staying so long. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's all
Things
yours.
have genuinely gotten complex when as fine a Cartesian mind as my friend Ambassador Vimont speaks of increasing complexity rather than being able to reduce things to three clear principles. I will attempt that, at least three lenses, and try to talk about the region and Saudi Arabia from a functional perspective, through the lens of partnership, and through a more global lens. I should say before I do that I wanted to speak last only to give you a break between State Department perspectives. Since my colleague Bill Burns spoke to you at lunch, I thought if you listened to these distinguished speakers between, you might forget enough of what he said that you would not recognize it when I said it again. I also want to thank Steve Clemons, my friend the irrepressible Steve Clemons. The New America Foundation is very dear to my heart. When I accepted the job at the State Department, I had to resign from all my boards, and I can't say I did so with a uniformly heavy heart. Indeed, in many cases, I was jumping for joy. But in the case of the New America Foundation, I was very sorry to step off the board, and I'm very pleased, at least, to be able to benefit from the programming here in Washington. So I said I would start with a functional lens. When we talk about the Middle East in general, and when we talk about Saudi Arabia or any major country in the Middle East, we immediately, I think, take a strategic perspective. This is the most challenging strategic region in the world. Saudi Arabia has played a key strategic position for the United States for many decades. And indeed, we heard about a strategic regional architecture, a regional security architecture, which is both necessary and complicated from a strategic perspective. I don't challenge that perspective, but I think we often miss the opportunities that come from a more functional perspective. And when I say functional, I mean the things on the ground that people and local governments and national governments need on the ground to improve the conditions in their country, the lives of their people. And from that perspective, whether it is water or health, or, as we heard earlier, education and the tremendous Saudi initiatives in education, but indeed there are initiatives in education throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Any of these, or science connected to education, but building scientific infrastructure, telecommunications. In all these areas, there is actually much more going on the ground now than there has been, starting in North Africa, moving across to the Middle East and beyond. If we were to think about mapping the region less in terms of grand strategic architecture and more in terms of functional networks, where there are different groups, different projects involving different countries in each of these areas and other functional areas, I think you would see a denser set of relationships than we do when we look just strategically. And you would see Saudi Arabia often playing a very important role in those relationships that we, again, do not necessarily see when we look more strategically. Now, the obvious one is energy. That is both strategic and functional. But again, I would focus on things like looking at water resources throughout the Middle East, looking at how to build a new and educated population with the younger generation, science, health. Very little known that diabetes is a huge challenge in the Middle East. We're used to thinking about that in the United States, less so in the Middle East. What can be done to combat that health threat and others? How do we engage the countries in the region? How are they already engaged? So I would start by suggesting that as we look at our relationship with Saudi Arabia and we look at the relationships of Saudi Arabia with other countries in the region, we pay more attention to the functional relationships that are already there. How do we bolster those? How do we connect them? How do we strengthen them? And ultimately, how do we connect them to a grander strategic architecture? Second point is the lens of partnership. Many of you probably have seen the article, The King and Us by David Otway, in the Foreign Affairs issue, the previous one, the one that just came out in January and February, which says that the U.S.-Saudi relationship has been a special relationship, but now, I'm quoting him, this is not coming from me, but that it has been a special relationship, and now increasingly the Saudis would prefer to see it as an ordinary relationship. I'm not going to take a view on whether that's right or not, but I think that may not be the right way to frame U.S.-Saudi relations in terms of a particular kind of relationship, but rather to look through the lens of partnership. The difference is partnership rests on common interests. So in those areas where we have common interests, we are partners. But it also allows for the possibility that there are areas where we do not have common interests, and then we have to agree to disagree or we diverge. So if we think about it from that perspective, and again, you heard from Bill Burns at lunch, he talked a great deal about our partnership with Saudi Arabia. It means asking the question, first of all, what are our common interests? Where do we, in fact, agree on specific policies? Now, the most obvious is the one we just heard about. We both have a very strong interest in an Israeli-Palestinian peace, a stable, durable peace that will help shore up the region as a whole. So there we share the interests of the Arab Peace Initiative. We have a strong partnership. We hope to build on that partnership. Second, and looking at the title of this entire conference, the U.S.-Saudi relations in a world without an equilibrium. I'm not sure if we can bring equilibrium to the world, but I'm quite certain that we and Saudi Arabia both have a strong interest in establishing a stable equilibrium in the Middle East. That both of us, looking at the region, the neighborhood for Saudi Arabia, a key strategic region for us, see the value in reestablishing a stable equilibrium as we withdraw troops from Iraq, as we reintegrate Iraq into the region, and of course, as we all address the problems of Iran. So there too, we have a strong partnership. We also have a strong interest in prosperity throughout the region. And here I don't think we've paid enough attention to a U.S.-Saudi economic partnership, not simply with respect to oil or our bilateral relations, but with respect to developing a strong economy throughout the Middle East, which can, among other things, absorb the tremendous youth bulge of often unemployed young people today, but also lay the foundation for a diverse economy that, if you have Israeli-Palestinian peace, is also going to be critical to rebuilding the region. So looking at it much more through an economic lens. And finally, again in terms of partnership, a Middle East based on tolerance. We've heard a lot about the interfaith dialogue, King Abdullah's interfaith dialogue. It is a very important initiative, one, in my view, that it deserves as much attention as the Arab Peace Initiative, because it is a statement about a view of Islam, about a view of the great religions of the world coexisting in the Middle East. I agree with former Senator Fowler about the links between President Obama, or the spiritual connection there, and the understanding of the role of religion in people's lives. The idea of a partnership working together for an interfaith dialogue in the Middle East and more broadly around the world is a very important area of partnership. So if we think about it, again, from a functional lens, from a lens of partnership, and we focus on where we do have common interests, where we don't try to force those through a relationship where that will not necessarily work. And finally, to think about Saudi Arabia through a more global lens. I lived last year for 10 months in Shanghai, which I recommend for no other reason that it changes your view of the global map irrevocably. Those of us who've grown up, of course, with the Atlantic as the center of the map. Well, from China, actually, the Middle East looks like the center of the global map. Well, actually, from Chinese perspective, China is the center of the global map. But as a Westerner living in China, I was very conscious continually of essentially the rebuilding of ancient trade routes, of the old Silk Road. The number of not only Chinese, but Asians generally moving back and forth to the Middle East. Patterns of trade that were around before this country was either discovered by the Europeans or even before Native Americans were here, as best we can tell. These are very old relationships, and they are being reforged rapidly. If we think about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East more generally from that perspective, we once again see it really as a crossroads of the world, and not just a neighborhood that is strategically important to the United States and often a source of difficulties. Similarly, it's important to think about the countries of the Middle East, and particularly Saudi Arabia, as having a much more diversified global portfolio. Of course, the relationship with the United States is very important, but it is not the only relationship of key importance to the Saudi government. And when you look at it from global perspective, you realize the strategic interest the Saudi government has in having a diversified portfolio. If you think then also of the role that Saudi Arabia has played recently in the G20. Saudi Arabia was the only OPEC member in the G20. If you think about efforts to work on Darfur, we immediately think about the influence of the Saudi government. When we think about Pakistan, we think about the efforts and the partnership that we need with the Saudi government. So more broadly, we often, I think, in the United States have thought about our relationships with Saudi Arabia, like our relations with many countries, in a kind of hub and spokes model. We're the hub to us, and we think of our relationships primarily bilaterally. So we look at our bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia. Increasingly, and exactly as a result of the complexity that Ambassador Vimont described, the number of actors, the density of relationships in all directions, we are, of course, a hub, a central node in many global networks. But there are many other nodes, and there is an increasingly complex web of networks. And in that context, Saudi Arabia is playing an increasingly important role with its own web of relationships. So I would conclude by saying, as we think about the United States and Saudi Arabia in a world without an equilibrium, we ought to be thinking functionally through the lens of partnership, through a global lens. But we also ought to be thinking of the tremendous opportunities that are there for us to work with the Saudis, but also for Saudi Arabia to work with many other countries in reestablishing an equilibrium that would start in the Middle East and extend outwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Anne-Marie, do you mind if I just pick up on you first? You've just given a very eloquent exposition of what the US and Saudi Arabia have in common, the interests that they have in common. Could you focus on one aspect, one interest that these two countries don't have in common, which is the Obama administration's desire to build a post-carbon economy? And how is that going to impact relations with Saudi Arabia?
Well, if I could predict that, I would have a crystal ball. But I think that is an area in which, as the United States takes an increasingly active role in combating climate change, in energy security, and looking for new forms of energy, we are going to have to be able to disagree in certain areas, respectfully understanding the disagreement there, where we need to disagree, does not then change the entire tenor of the relationship. That's what I meant by, when we see it as a special relationship, then any disagreement can undermine it. we see it as an ordinary relationship. I think it's more than that, but that may be an area where one would hope we could be partners. But if we can't be in certain areas, we will have
It's
to.
still largely a single product economy.
It is, although many of its neighbors in the Middle East, of course, are diversifying in various ways. And I'm not going to presume to speak to the Saudi policy there, but I could imagine that there's plenty of sunshine in Saudi Arabia as well.
We'll get on to general questions in a moment, but I can't resist asking my compatriot Neil one question, and you'll forgive me. Perhaps you won't forgive me, actually, for asking this question. You paint a very rosy picture of UK-Saudi relations, or a very positive picture at any rate. If you were to ask most people in Britain, and perhaps some people in this town, to name one aspect of UK-Saudi relations, they would talk about the allegations of corruption with the arms deal, the Tornado jet, the $40 billion, the largest arms deal in British history, and the fact that Tony Blair called off a corruption inquiry because the Saudis threatened joint cooperation in a whole number of areas, including on counterterrorism. How does that fit in with your relatively upbeat picture of relations between the two countries?
Well, I think it's a good question, and thank you, Ed.
You've forgiven me already, thank you.
And had the ambassador been able to give me longer to prepare for this, I probably could give you a more lucid answer than I'm about to give. I think this, I mean, as I said, when I first joined the Foreign Office, my first job was dealing with Saudi Arabia. And I think those who know anything about the UK-Saudi relationship is we've had a long series of, normally about every 5 or 7 years, series of quite tricky bilateral issues to deal with. We had a major row over the broadcasting of a film, Death of a Princess. When I first started the job in 1995, we had a major row over the presence of Saudi dissidents in London, who at the time we thought were, some of whom were sort of on the right side of the law in terms of incitement. Now some of whom have since been prosecuted. And we've had, there are inevitably differences that emerge from situations in which our cultures are very different. So there have been differences over, for example, detention of nurses in jail. So you perhaps you're right that the positive impression is not necessarily shared by everybody in the system. And I think a Saudi would say the same thing about the United Kingdom. I think my understanding of the decision on the arms contract was a very difficult one to take. There were independent prosecutors pursuing at the time. So there were doubts about the evidential basis they had to pursue this. And the decisions were also taken on wider national security grounds and the need to maintain terrorism cooperation in these areas and the need to maintain a broader strategic relationship with the country with which we have very important common interests across the board. I confess I don't know too much more than that about the background to the decision to take that. It was a difficult decision, but it is an area, the area of corruption is an area where the UK has very strong laws and an area where we're committed to improving transparency.
It's a decision, I believe, that's still being actively reviewed here by the Department of Justice. Final question I'm going to ask, since it's my prerogative. Abdul Rahman, could you, just taking into account the Obama administration's different tack towards Iran and its overtures towards Iran, if those failed, as I believe many in Saudi Arabia think these efforts will fail, and Iran did move towards nuclear weapons, how quickly afterwards would Saudi Arabia follow? And would it get its nuclear capability from Pakistan?
Ooh.
I said blunt and simplistic. It's because
well, there are plenty of
ifs
ifs there. So let's hope that these ifs do not materialize. I guess we are all hopeful that Iran, as it has said recently, will want to meet with the international community, with the group of six, and discuss this issue. But I think Saudi Arabia is not keen on acquiring nuclear weapons. I think we would like to see that our neighbors, Iran or all of the other neighbors, would in fact not have nuclear weapons. But now this is a question that needs to be, we need to see what happens in the next, few months or maybe a year or two. I am optimistic and hopeful that it will be resolved in a way that is good for everyone in our part of the world.
You all blunted my questions very skillfully. Could I ask people to ask short questions, not make statements, and be as sharp as you can possibly be? Please, sir, your hand's been up. Given time constraints, I don't know how much longer we've got.
My question is to Dr. Abdurrahman Al-Saeed. Perhaps Dr. Slaughter would then want to comment. We've heard from Undersecretary Burns that the United States might find it hard to deal with a Palestinian Authority of which Hamas was a part if Hamas did not accept certain ground rules, i.e. Recognition of Israel, recognition of previous agreements. Forget about the fact that Netanyahu may not recognize previous agreements. But meanwhile, in talking to my Palestinian friends recently, they've always told me in the past that Saudi Arabia is a big supporter. They can count on Saudi Arabia to come through with its pledges when others do not. But lately, they're saying that that Saudi Arabia is withholding aid from the PA, presumably because you want to pressure them to go into a coalition with Hamas. How does your policy, what is your policy towards a coalition between the two, and how does that differ from the U.S. policy?
First of all, I think our Minister of Finance answered that question rather clearly. He said, and I repeat, that Saudi Arabia was ready and willing and would love, in fact, to deliver on its promise. There are difficulties relating to borders and to many things, but once these are removed, that in fact what Saudi Arabia has promised it will deliver. We have a track record. Ted, you know better than anyone else here that Saudi Arabia always delivers on its promises. You've been there, you know the area, you know how we deal with these issues. Now, on the question of whether we would like to see a coalition of the Palestinians, I think, of course, this goes without saying that we would like to see a united Palestinian front, that we will work for it, that in fact we have worked for it in Mecca, as you remember. And I think we will do everything we can to put back the one united Palestinian front or government. But I think this is a problem that you need to look at it in perspective. The problems of the Palestinians are, of course, not only related to the Palestinians. They're of course part and parcel of what's happening in the area. Israel's, I think, obstinance in its negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, where throughout these negotiations no results were attained by the Palestinian Authority, makes it very difficult for everyone in our part of the world, and in fact gives reason to those who want to, or those who think that no good will come out of any agreement with the Israelis. So I think, King Abdullah's peace initiative, or the Arab Peace Initiative, as you know, it's again part of the extended hand. And that is something that is not for one party to do. It's something that both we and, of course, the other party, the Arab world and the Israelis, they have to reciprocate. They haven't. And all we have seen through the last 7 or almost 8 years now is, I guess, that is not encouraging. And that, I think, gives an excuse to those who say, why should we? What will come out of this? So let's hope that with the new environment, with this new administration now, with the hopes that are being raised by President Obama's moves, sending George Mitchell and seeing all the things that have been said, that we'll have a new environment that will encourage everyone to come aboard, including Hamas and the others.
Questions and answers are great. I'm going to use my prerogative here as an organizer to encourage brevity in the last few minutes of this conference. So that goes for responders and those questioners. So that's back to you.
Please, sir.
Hi, Bill Nash from the Middle East Policy Council. And thanks to all of you for your presentations. Appreciate it very, very, very much. I've heard everybody talk about time is running out. That we've got to act on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. King Abdullah of Jordan said no more process, just action. How do you keep the window of opportunity open while you try to deal with the situation? What are the actions that you can put the jam in the window closing now to allow the process, to allow the initiatives to take place?
Is this directed at anybody? Anne-Marie, do you want to answer this? Sorry.
Give me the easy one. I think the United States, the administration's policy has been absolutely to plunge in right away, which is the first key thing you can do, which is not to wait and not to say, well, we'll hang on right now and we'll have a series of meetings, but we're actively there. At this point, there's no way to answer your question before Prime Minister Netanyahu has met with President Obama, before some of the parameters have actually, I think, been established in terms of where we actually are. I would say we're actively engaged in that process to not only keep the window open, but to open it as much as possible to establish an actual process. I shouldn't say that, not to establish a process, but to see what concretely can be accomplished now and then beyond. We have only had a government we can even deal with for a couple of weeks. So on that, with respect to that particular issue.
Madam. The mic's just behind you.
Thank you so much. Farah Atasi, President of the Arab Information and Resource Center. Recently, Ambassador Chas Freeman was candidate to lead the National Intelligence Council, NIC, and unfortunately, he has been under so much attack from the media, from the Israeli lobby, from so many other interest groups because of his close ties with the Saudi and with the Chinese. How we can understand such, contradiction with the U.S. administration trying to rebuild its image with the Muslim and with the Arab world, and not investing with the right people, having a remarkable person who spent a record in his life building bridges, who understand the region, who has a close ties. It should be viewed as a plus to have somebody who has a close ties with a critical ally, as you said, the Saudis and also the Chinese. Dr.
I'm going to help Ed because we need to move more quickly. So
sure.
We got it.
How,
the Chas
how
Freeman question.
Source of concern?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ambassador Fowler, as a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia yourself.
Brent Scowcroft was talking last night, those of us who were fortunate enough to hear him and Prince Turki, that we have the importance of the Saudi-American strategic alliance is well known to the people in this room, most of the policymakers, the press, on the macro level. What has not been understood is for the development of a deep understanding with the American people. And unfortunately, since I come from the Congress, and that's why I was given this loaded question, the members of Congress in both parties have made it their occupation during campaign time to praise the Israelis as the only great democracy, the only friend in the Middle East, knowing that they're going to get campaign contributions. And they try to pick up the other side of the votes by bashing the Saudis and saying they are despotic, they're non-democratic, and they've got us over the barrel, literally and figuratively, on oil prices. I want to say a little good word about the Saudis. They've been taking that very well. They expect it. And we have not had any policy repercussions from Saudi bashing by our politicians, both for the Congress and the President. And to me, that shows the strength of their tolerance, if not the depth of their relation. May I just say one other thing? I don't want to leave it on energy policy. Your first question. And Prince Turki again said it, the biggest problem on energy policy right now is not the administration, it's not the Saudis, it's the Congress, for some of the same reasons that I won't repeat. We also ought to give credit to the oil companies, the majors, who, and especially since I'm most familiar with them, with Chevron, who started their multi-million-dollar campaign, television campaign, back during the presidential race on energy interdependence. That there's no such thing as interdependence, there's no such thing as energy independence. And the other oil companies, most of them have come along. From the Saudi side, Mr. Naimi goes all over the world saying the world needs all the BTUs it can find from whatever source. We welcome it. And if we would put those two together, get rid of this energy independent talk, and work on policies of energy interdependence, which includes not only the fossil fuels, but all these alternative energies, then you would see that both the producers and the suppliers, I think, would come together, and we would have a comprehensive policy.
We have time for a couple more, I think. Please, sir.
Thanks. John Hendricks with STI. Let me reprise your question about the climate policy in the post-carbon world just a little bit, in the sense that that put it in the situation that perhaps a future energy situation would be without a lot of fossil fuels at all. And perhaps it might be with fossil fuels with carbon sequestration and lots of other effects. And so, in fact, to get any sort of halfway efficient climate policy, though, it's got to be some sort of a global agreement. And essentially, a lot of it is a diplomatic
Could you
question.
get to a question? Sorry, I'm being rude.
That's right. And well, when you asked Dr. Slaughter, she said, well, maybe it's a matter of difference of an area where we differ. I would say maybe it's a diplomatic question of getting more international agreements so that we have a policy that puts fuels in the places where they're really most efficient and gives you the best way to reduce the carbon load without bankrupting one country or the other. So what do you think about it as a diplomatic policy question?
I think it's a completely fair point. I was simply pointing out that our interests may not converge at the moment, but that doesn't mean for a minute that it wouldn't be better off, absolutely, as Ambassador Fowler said, recognizing the interdependence of global energy sources if we weren't working diplomatically to reach agreement not only on mitigation, but also on alternative sources and also the most efficient use of the sources we've already got.
So.
Andrew Pierre, Georgetown University. We are very concerned now about the stability of Pakistan, perhaps for very good reason. And my question is, to what extent is Pakistan's stability and the whole question of radicalization of Islam a significant issue within Pakistan? I'll ask Mr. Al-Said about that. And to what extent could the United States and the Western world in general seek more support in its policy vis-a-vis Pakistan from the Middle East in general and Saudi Arabia in particular, beyond the $700 million, I think, which was cited earlier? Thank you.
Well, we have in Saudi Arabia, if I may say, a very good relationship with the Pakistani people and the Pakistani government. And I think we have done everything that a friend and a brother will do in time of distress. We have extended a hand to the Pakistanis. We have sent our the chief of our intelligence, Prince Mughal bin Abdul Aziz, went there a couple of times to talk to them, to their leaders. These are public missions. There are probably other not public missions that have been undertaken. But I think that a lot has been done on the part of Saudi Arabia to help the Pakistanis to work their problems. And I think we will continue to do that.
Madam, sorry. Yes.
We'll make this the last one.
Okay.
So make it good.
Okay, sure. A couple of questions, Sam.
No, just one question. Sorry.
One to the panel, one to...
Okay.
So on Saudi Arabia, do you think empowering the Shia in Saudi would undermine Iran's influence within Saudi territory? And كان عندي سؤال ثاني بس I'll leave it at that. على الwomen in advancing to highest public office, you know, as career politicians and career diplomats. يعني how do you envision the steps for that to happen for women? Third, to the panel on tolerance, I see that there has not been established a politically correct language addressing Muslims in the mainstream. As an example, I've seen some...
I have really, we have minutes, we have cut off, so just ask your question. I'm
okay,
sorry. It's my job.
Just to illustrate, on the Washington Post, there was a picture of a man, a soldier, praying in bowing, and it said something about terrorism. Why is it not frowned upon to make that association? Should we not advance tolerance by advancing the language we use, and that would help
Great question.
diplomacy?
So Muslims and terrorists on one hand, and position of it. Why don't we, and I apologize for cutting in, Ed, but we've got to bring it to close. So
please do.
Abdul Rahman?
You know, I honestly didn't understand the question.
Well, I think in part the question
Forgive
was...
me.
The newspapers will soon be out of business. That'll solve that last problem.
This is completely
women's
untrue.
issues in the region. Henry,
I
you
wish
have a
to
response?
object to that remark.
Henry?
I did it for your benefit.
Women and
Yeah.
Shia.
Is that...
Yeah, no,
We
the
live
first
in
question was
financial
about
times.
Shia, empowering Shia in Saudi Arabia, and the response to whether that would in fact help weaken Iran, and then a question about the role of women in Saudi Arabia.
Well, as far as the Shia community in Saudi Arabia, if that's the question, we have now members from the Shia community in our Shura Council. They have the Shia community is being involved in the national dialogue. I think that the attention to the Shia localities and cities is as I think as equal to any part of the country. I think there has been a great deal of improvement, a sea change, in fact, in that area. Now, as far as women are concerned, there was a time when you didn't have women in participating, and now we have women who are heads of universities. We have, I think lots of people have talked about Dr. Noor Al-Faiz, who is now a Deputy Minister of Education. Women now control, according to the Chamber of Commerce, something like 25% of the wealth of the country. Please correct me, people who know about this, about the business community. So plenty has been happening lately. Believe me, Some people would like more, and more is being done. You see more women writing about women issues, by the way, and the Saudi media, more forcefully, more, I think, lots is being done. It's not probably as great as some would like, but it is, I think, in tandem with what we as a society would like to see take place.
Can I say one
Yes,
word about that?
yes.
So on your question about the terminology, I think it's a very important question because certainly President Obama talks much more about violent extremists than he does about Islamic terrorists, and he does that very deliberately as part of outreach to the Muslim world to avoid constantly having Islam and terrorism being connected. But there is a further question about whether or not the term moderate Muslims is the right term. It is a term you hear a great deal. I would be much more interested actually in hearing King Abdullah, other both Saudis, but other members of the Muslim community characterize themselves rather than a tag that is now often applied, which may or may not be the right way. I think our poverty of language still betrays our poverty of understanding.
Pierre?
Can I make just a point about tolerance? Because I think that was the question it was all about. And I think your question was very right. But you should look at the other way around also. What we're facing at the moment is really a question of reciprocity in many of these countries. In fact, because my father was a diplomat, I was born in Tunisia. 30 or 40 years ago in Tunisia, everybody could practice its religion without many problems. It's not the same today. Jewish community, Christians had to leave. Think about the Christians in Iraq. So I think if we really want to go on, as we're doing, rightly so in my opinion, building mosques in Europe, in France for instance, I think it should work also the other way around. And this is what it's all about when you're talking about the dialogue of civilizations or culture or religion. It has to do on a reciprocity base. Otherwise, we're in for a great problem.
Ed, if I may, I'm going to come in. First of all, I want to say Ed Luce. It's hard, when you're at the end of the conference and you're under a time deadline. I want to thank Ed Luce very much for chairing this session. And, my goal, and I apologize to people about cutting them off or getting to brevity, but when you've got, I was amazed at Bill Burns today, who took about 25 questions, boom, 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 boom. And that is a goal and a style I hope we can achieve in other sessions. Because when you have larger forums, our goal in today's conference was to bring the broad general question of U.S.-Saudi relations more into a public airing. I've been told we've had about 400 people through these doors this morning. We've had many thousands watching online, an average about 300 to 350 online all day, all the time in watching the live streaming. So many more people who are interested, public policy junkies, no doubt, but nonetheless are very interested in what we're doing. And in this last panel, what I was hoping, and particularly because we didn't get a question to Joe McMillan, I wanted to bring many different lenses to this question of the broader Middle East, and this was a fantastic panel. And I want to thank Ed Luce from his position of being such a great chronicler of our political order here in Washington. Pierre Vimont, who recently held a blogger breakfast meeting, for which we're very grateful, and shared a lot of insights into the dynamics of the Middle East that I was glad to see came out today. Joe, thanks so much from the Pentagon for coming over here and giving the view of the international security affairs where so much is in transition. Mike Fowler, your leadership is much appreciated. Abdul Rahman Al-Said, I know you're going to say a word in just a moment, and I want to thank you very much for his support. He hangs out with the king, I hear now and then, and I get all the protocol wrong, I know. But we got kind of a wink and nod that this was a good conference, and thus we had an incredible array of talent from Saudi Arabia in this meeting. Neil, thank you so much for standing in for the ambassador and chairing this. Anne-Marie Slaughter, I wrote on my blog the other day, has the coolest job in the business. There are three, in my view, and this is my own parochial view. One is, I think anybody who's head of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Jessica Matthews has that job, is great. The other is the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, the great job. And then there's the sort of George Kennan, Paul Nitze job. And that's policy planning at the Department of State, where you do have, and some people have had the opportunity to rewire the way this country goes. We happen to have the grandson of Paul Nitze working for the New America Foundation as a fellow. and he's writing a book on Kenan and Nizza and their rivalry. This is a young man named Nick Thompson. And so I'm going to leave Anne-Marie alone for a while, but I want to get her come back when we release that book, that Simon & Schuster book. But please join me in thanking Anne-Marie Slaughter, Neil Crompton, Abdulrahman Al-Said, Mike Fowler, Joe McMillan, Pierre Vimont, and Ed Luce. It's been a long day, and I appreciate everyone for hanging in with us. I want to thank a number of people, and we'll then wrap this up. Richard Wilson, these are all the folks who have been carrying the microphones, making sure you got fed at your seat, not taking breaks. Richard Wilson, Aaron Drankowski, Stephanie Gunter, Patrick Doherty, Ben Catcher, Kate Brown, Crystal Cook, Emily Gallagher, Jonathan Geyer, Benjamin Hakem-Var, Cecile Isidro, Mike Jones, who's been running the streaming all day, Tom Kutch, Wynn Monroe, Danny Mandel, Kate Schuler, Sam Sheridan, Catherine Tiedman, Troy Schneider, Patrick Doherty, Omar Balaliwa, Lucian Ziegler, Khaled Al-Saif, Abdul Aziz Al-Fahad, and then two colleagues of mine, for those of you who want to have a continuing relationship with the New American Foundation, who run our Middle East Task Force, Daniel Levy and Amjad Atallah. Daniel just got back from Israel last night as a briefing on many of the same issues, a group of UN diplomats in New York today, but Amjad Atallah has been with us as well. I want to thank all of these folks for making today a success, because I get too much credit, and they really do everything. So please give them a round of applause. I want to thank all of our sponsors, and particularly thank the Committee for International Trade from the Saudi Chambers of Commerce. So this meeting is adjourned. Let's hang out. We can have coffee, but get off the stage. Thank you so much.